World War III has already begun. That's an extreme statement, one that bears a heavy burden of proof. You should be skeptical. However, it's important to note that real skepticism is not blind disbelief, but rather the suspension of belief until sufficient evidence is provided. In this video, we're going to provide you with that evidence. Everything we talk about here will be documented in links in the description. I strongly encourage you to do your own research and to verify what we're talking about. Let's start with the definition of a world war. World War I and World War II weren't named as such because they involved every single country on the planet, but rather because these conflicts drew in the most powerful nations and were spread out over a large geographical area. Now, though the reductionist history we're taught in school marks the beginnings of the first two world wars at specific physical flashpoints such as Hitler's invasion of Poland for Europe or the attack on Pearl Harbor for the United States, the early stages of these conflicts had actually begun to develop many years prior. For example, Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor was a culmination of many months of intentional provocation by the US. This was revealed in the 8 Points Bulletin, which was declassified years later, but it's still never mentioned in textbooks. Likewise, the mutual defense treaties which were immediately activated by this attack were already in place, and the secondary results could have easily been predicted by anyone who had been paying attention. Unfortunately, at that time, the internet wasn't available, and the public was caught completely off guard. World War I planted the seeds for World War II, which transitioned directly into the Cold War. In the post-World War II era, the advent of the CIA and the strategy of using politically motivated NGOs to destabilize countries changed the way war was waged, placing a much greater emphasis on covert operations and proxy wars than outright combat. Such operations blurred the definition of war, particularly in the mind of the public, and it made it much harder to define clear start points and end points. Can you name all the countries the US toppled between 1950 and 1991? Most people can't. The end of the Cold War and the power vacuum that the fall of the Soviet Union created invited 20 years of military expansionism on the part of the United States. And this laid the groundwork for the next global conflict. This next global conflict is what we're referring to as World War III. Now, to establish this is in fact a world war, let's first take a look at the geographic scope of the current conflicts underway. Afghanistan is still clearly occupied by US forces, and as the official military prepares to withdraw in 2014, private military forces are being brought in. Also, there are no plans to discontinue the drone program in Afghanistan anytime soon. The Iraq War is supposedly over, and there's been a drastic drawdown of US troops. However, the overt occupation is now being replaced by a covert occupation run by the CIA, which has one of its largest stations in Baghdad. Obama has expanded Bush's drone program into Yemen, Somalia, Algeria, Libya, and Pakistan. In parallel, the Dagger Brigade has deployed US forces to 35 African countries this year, and the Pentagon has put boots on the ground in Mali as of April. And let's not forget that Obama toppled the Libyan government in 2011. The US has been running intensive war games and drills with South Korea since February, and they are ongoing in spite of the lack of media attention in the past month. North Korea is calling these drills, which included simulated nuclear strikes and naval maneuvers, wanton provocations and rehearsals for war. This really isn't an exaggeration since the US just recently signed a mutual defense treaty with South Korea, which makes it significantly easier for the US to get militarily involved in that region. The US has pushed for multiple rounds of sanctions against Iran, supposedly to discourage them from building a nuke, even though the CIA and Mossad both agree that the Iranian leadership hasn't even made the decision to build a bomb, much less even start. The US and Israeli governments aren't one to let pesky little things like facts keep them from promoting military strikes on Iran. But since they haven't gotten much traction with this approach from the international community, they've moved on to less direct tactics. And that brings us to Syria. Iran's closest ally is Syria. And on Friday, May 3rd, 2013, Israel attacked Syria. This after their attempt at framing the Syrian government for chemical weapons fell apart. The US has been stepping up its material support for the Syrian rebels, though they still publicly claim that they aren't supplying them with weapons. This is just a public relations smokescreen. On May 26, Lebanon was attacked by NATO-backed insurgents due to Hezbollah's support for the Syrian government. Russia has taken a firm stand against US, NATO, and Israeli attempts to topple the Syrian government, and is still planning to send a shipment of S-300 anti-aircraft missiles to the country. In response, Israel's President Netanyahu reportedly warned Putin that Moscow's sale of the sophisticated missile defense system to Assad could push the Middle East into war, and argued that the S-300 had no relevance to Assad's internal battles against rebel groups. This statement, coming right on the heels of the unprovoked Israeli airstrikes on Damascus this month, leaves little doubt as to what these missiles are intended for and why Israel is angry. Of course, Netanyahu doesn't like this. He wants to be able to continue attacking Syria with impunity. Now, this past week, Russia moved a group of warships from their Pacific Fleet into the Eastern Mediterranean for the first time in decades to, quote, protect Russia's interest in the region. This move counters the US naval presence which has built up in the area over the past several years. Both of these moves are direct statements about their intentions regarding Syria and Iran. This is only a rough summary of the early stages of this conflict. Much is being left out here. But this should be enough to establish this is indeed a world war. Now as for the players, how are they divided? Who's allied with who? On one side we have China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, Syria, and a handful of nations in South America. The role of the South American nations in this conflict has been strictly economic, but as we'll discuss later, economics is central in this crisis. On the other side we have the United States, Israel, and NATO, which includes most of Western Europe, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and a handful of others. So clearly the most powerful nations in the world are involved. If tomorrow a direct war between the United States and Russia were to break out, this would mark the official beginning of World War III. But obviously this wouldn't really be accurate. A proxy war between the US and Russia is already underway in Syria and in Iran, and a currency war is already underway between the United States and China. The question here is really only one of scale. How far will this go? Will the US and its allies back down before this escalates into an open war involving the big players? Obviously it's impossible to answer that question with 100% certainty. These are human decisions, and even madmen sometimes have moments of lucidity. However, when you understand why these wars are happening, it becomes clear that it is highly unlikely that the US and its allies will back down. So why is this happening? What is the motive for this aggressive posture by the United States and its allies? We've talked about this in detail in a number of videos, including The Road to World War III, which explains the history of the petrodollar and how it pertains to this current conflict. So we won't rehash all those details here. But to summarize, this war is a war for the control of the global financial system. The dollar is nearing the end of its days, and the powers that be know this. They could let the dollar fall and allow the rest of the world to choose their own course. They don't want to. The powers that be would much rather take a gamble and stake it all in an attempt to control the currency that will replace the dollar. If they have it their way, this new currency will be a truly global currency.
I think we've all got to move towards that opportunity, and I think the challenge also is whether we should move towards an international currency, because the speculation and the complexity of currency has caused some of the irritation, not only among the trading nations, but among individuals.
This global currency will be accompanied by global government, which they will claim is necessary to prevent another tragic war like the one they're setting off right now. It's a classic problem-reaction-solution setup, where those that create the problem manipulate the public into accepting a solution that puts more power into their hands. They are going to attempt this one way or another. If they don't, then they will lose everything. The question is, how will we respond? Will you fall for this? Will you send your sons and daughters to fight in these corrupt wars with your eyes closed and your hand on your heart? Or will you at least speak out? This is the real variable. This is what will determine the final outcome. If you appreciate this message, and if you want others to hear it, you can help by liking this video, adding it to your favorites, and sharing it to Facebook, Twitter, your blog, and by sending it to your friends via email. If you'd like more videos like this, subscribe to Storm Clouds Gathering on YouTube. For updates and bonus content, be sure to follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/stormcloudsgathering, on Twitter at Collapse Updates, and our website is stormcloudsgathering.com.